Beloved, understand this truth as we begin. Life is governed by laws, both spiritual and natural. Nothing happens by accident. When people suffer repeated defeats, delays, rejections, or unexplained battles, very often there is a verdict spoken or enforced in the realm of the spirit, authorizing that experience. But hear me clearly today. No verdict is superior to the verdict of God. Tonight, this Monday, the 9th of February, we are not gathered to complain, to beg, or to negotiate from a position of weakness. We are standing on superior authority. The God who judges righteously, the God whose court cannot be bribed, the God who speaks once and it is established forever, that God is present to cancel every negative verdict over your life. Understand this truth deeply. God is not one judge among many. He is the supreme judge, the final authority over every realm, visible and invisible. Every system that exists derives legitimacy from him, whether it acknowledges it or not. Earth has courts, institutions, panels, and decision makers, but all of them operate under a higher jurisdiction. When God speaks, no appeal can overturn it. When God rules, no power can veto it. Many believers struggle because they see men as final authorities, forgetting that there is a throne higher than every throne and a voice louder than every verdict. In life, verdicts are constantly being issued. Some are spoken openly by employers, doctors, family elders, or institutions. Others are issued silently through patterns, repeated outcomes, cycles of loss, and invisible resistance. A verdict is simply an authorization for an outcome to continue. When something keeps repeating, despite effort, prayer, and sincerity, it is often because there is a permission backing it. But hear this clearly. No permission is eternal if God withdraws his consent. God is not emotional in judgment. He is righteous. His judgments are not reactions. They are decisions rooted in truth. This is why scripture reveals him not only as father, but also as judge. A father can feel compassion. A judge must also enforce justice. The power of approaching God as judge is that judgments can be reviewed, appeals can be made, evidence can be presented, mercy can be lawfully accessed. Many people pray without understanding jurisdiction. They cry, fast, shout, and sow, yet they never address the legal dimension of their problem. Heaven is not confused about your tears, but heaven responds to order. When you come before God recognizing his supreme authority, you are not asking him to fight battles emotionally. You are asking him to rule. And when God rules, chaos must bow. Negative verdicts often gain strength because people assume they are final. This is how my family is. This is how my life has always been. Nothing ever works for me. These statements may sound casual, but they are acknowledgments of authority. The moment you believe a verdict is final, you empower it. But revelation breaks agreement. When you understand that God is above every system, you withdraw your belief from inferior judgments. There are verdicts issued by time, saying it is too late. Verdicts issued by age, saying opportunity has passed. Verdicts issued by background, saying your origin limits your outcome. Verdicts issued by mistakes, saying your past disqualifies your future. But God does not judge from time. He judges from eternity. He does not judge from age. He judges from purpose. He does not judge from history. He judges from redemption. In the court of heaven, your case is not assessed by your worst moment, but by covenant. The enemy prosecutes using facts, but God judges using truth. Facts may say you failed, but truth says you are redeemed. Facts may say the door is closed, but truth says God opens doors no man can shut. Facts may say you deserve consequences, but truth says mercy triumphs over judgment. This is why approaching God as supreme judge is powerful. You are not denying facts, you are appealing to a higher truth. When God issues a verdict, it overrides all lower conclusions. Doctors may give reports, but God gives judgments. Economies may issue predictions, but God issues decrees. Families may place labels, but God releases names. When God overturns a verdict, he does not argue with darkness. He does not negotiate with opposition. He simply speaks. And when he speaks, systems realign. People change their minds without knowing why. Doors open without explanation. Resistance dissolves without confrontation. This is the effect of a superior judgment entering a system. Beloved, never forget this. You are not at the mercy of human decisions. You are not trapped by ancestral outcomes. You are not sentenced by past errors. If God be judge over your life, then every other verdict is subject to review. What men called final can be revisited. What circumstances declared impossible can be rewritten. This is why prayer must begin with revelation. Once you know who God is, fear loses authority. Once you know where God sits, intimidation collapses. Once you know that heaven's court outranks every earthly system, you stop begging and start standing. So today, anchor this truth in your spirit. The highest court has jurisdiction over your life. And when that court rules in your favor, no power, seen or unseen, can reverse it. Negative verdicts are not imaginary ideas or poetic expressions. They are real spiritual conclusions that authorize certain experiences to continue in a person's life. Many believers suffer unnecessarily because they assume that if something is happening, then it must be the will of God. But spiritual maturity begins when you learn to distinguish between what exists and what is permitted. Not everything that exists has divine approval. Some things exist because no one has challenged the verdict sustaining them. A negative verdict is simply a judgment that favors limitation, loss, delay, or pain. It can be issued through words, actions, agreements, covenants, or even silence. Some verdicts are pronounced directly through curses, condemnations, or evil pronouncements. Others are enforced indirectly through repeated failure, cycles of frustration, and patterns that defy effort. The danger is not just the verdict itself, but the belief that it cannot be changed. Many people treat negative outcomes as permanent sentences rather than temporary authorizations. They say, this is my portion, this is how my life is, or I have accepted my fate. That acceptance becomes agreement, and agreement gives power. Darkness does not require your understanding to operate, but it requires your permission to remain. Permission is often given unconsciously through resignation. One of the greatest deceptions is the idea that once a verdict is issued, it cannot be reversed. That may be true in flawed human systems, but it is not true in the economy of God. Heaven has a provision called review. What was judged under ignorance can be revisited under light. What was concluded under accusation can be overturned under mercy. This is why negative verdicts, though real, are never final when God is involved. Negative verdicts can originate from many sources. Some come from generational patterns, families where poverty, sickness, failure, or instability repeat themselves like a script. Others come from personal mistakes, choices that open doors to consequences that outlived the season of the mistake. Some verdicts come from words spoken by authority figures, parents, teachers, leaders, whose voices carried weight at critical moments. And some verdicts are enforced by spiritual adversaries who exploit legal openings. However, the source of a verdict does not determine its permanence. Authority determines permanence. A verdict issued by darkness can only stand if it is not challenged by light. The moment superior authority appears, the lower ruling becomes illegal. This is why revelation is dangerous to darkness. The enemy fears awareness more than activity. Many believers pray about symptoms but never address the verdict. They rebuke poverty without confronting the judgment authorizing lack. They pray against sickness without dealing with the spiritual permission behind affliction. Until the verdict is cancelled, the manifestation will keep returning in another form. This is why some people experience temporary relief but no lasting freedom. Understand this: a negative verdict may be real, but it is not eternal. It exists in time, not in destiny. It has influence, not ownership. The enemy can influence outcomes, but he cannot define your end unless you surrender that right. God alone has the authority to define destiny. When God intervenes, he does not patch the situation, he changes the ruling. He does not manage the problem, he removes its legal right to exist. This is why divine intervention often looks sudden. It is not sudden in heaven, it is sudden on earth, because the verdict has been changed. Some of you are dealing with verdicts that say you will never move forward. Others are facing verdicts that say you will always struggle. Some hear verdicts that say your best days are behind you. These verdicts feel convincing because they are reinforced by evidence. But evidence does not equal authority. Evidence only shows what has been permitted so far. God specializes in overruling evidence. He does not deny reality, he redefines it. When he cancels a negative verdict, history loses its power to predict your future. Your yesterday no longer has the authority to explain your tomorrow. This is why prayer must shift from desperation to legislation. You are not pleading for sympathy. You are seeking justice. You are not asking God to ignore the case. You are asking him to rule. And when God rules, the case is closed. So hold this truth firmly. Negative verdicts are real, but they are temporary guests, not permanent landlords. They can speak, but they cannot decide. They can intimidate, but they cannot conclude. The final word belongs to God, and when he speaks, every other voice must be silent. Light is not a metaphor in the spirit. It is a governing force. Wherever light appears, it does not ask permission to function, and it does not negotiate with darkness. Darkness exists only as the absence of light, and the moment light is introduced, darkness loses both influence and authority. This is why spiritual victory is never first about strength or numbers. It is about illumination. When light enters a system, confusion gives way to clarity, bondage gives way to freedom, and resistance gives way to alignment. Darkness thrives on secrecy, ignorance, and misunderstanding. It gains confidence when people do not know what is happening to them or why it is happening. Many battles persist not because they are powerful, but because they are hidden. Once light exposes the root, the hold of darkness weakens automatically. This is why revelation is one of the greatest weapons in spiritual warfare. The enemy can survive activity, but he cannot survive exposure. Light carries legal authority because it originates from God. God does not just possess light, He is light. This means that when light is released, God's nature is expressed. Darkness cannot coexist with God's nature. It must retreat, not because it is afraid, but because it has no legal right to remain in that environment. Resistance against light is illegal in the spirit. Many people attempt to fight darkness with emotions, anger, or fear. But darkness is not defeated by volume or intensity. It is defeated by truth. Truth is light in expression. When truth is spoken, lies collapse. When truth is believed, deception loses its power. This is why the most dangerous moment for darkness is when a believer understands what belongs to them. Negative verdicts survive because they operate in obscurity. They are enforced quietly through patterns, assumptions, and internalized beliefs. People often fight the results of darkness without addressing the absence of light that allowed it to grow. But once light is introduced, the verdict sustaining darkness becomes invalid. Light does not merely reveal, it authorizes change. When light enters a situation, it brings order. It shows what should be corrected, removed, or restored. This is why God often begins deliverance by giving understanding. Once you see clearly, you cannot remain bound the same way. Knowledge does not just inform, it liberates. There are areas in many lives where darkness has survived, not because it is strong, but because light was never invited. Some avoided truth because it was uncomfortable. Others ignored revelation because it challenged long-held beliefs. But darkness is comfortable only until light arrives. Once light shines, even familiar bondage becomes unbearable. Light has jurisdiction over systems, families, finances, health, and destinies. When divine light enters a family line, patterns that survived generations suddenly collapse. When light enters a person's understanding, habits that seemed unbreakable lose their grip. When light enters destiny, confusion gives way to direction. Spiritual authority flows from alignment with light. The more light you carry, the more authority you exercise. This is why growth in the spirit is not measured only by activity, but by clarity. Confusion weakens authority. Understanding strengthens it. When you know who you are, what belongs to you, and what God has said, you speak differently, you pray differently, and you resist differently. Light also brings accountability. When light shines, excuses lose their power. Darkness often hides behind blame and justification, but light demands responsibility. This is not condemnation, it is empowerment. Once you see clearly, you can choose correctly. Light does not control you, it frees you to decide. This is why the entrance of light is always disruptive. It disrupts comfort zones, exposes hidden agreements, and challenges passive acceptance. But that disruption is necessary for freedom. Darkness prefers stability. Light produces transformation. When God releases light over a situation, he is not merely showing what is wrong. He is announcing that change is now legal. Heaven is declaring that the season of ignorance is over. What you know now gives you the authority to change what you tolerate. So understand this deeply. Light is not optional in spiritual victory. It is foundational. The authority to overturn darkness is not found in struggle, but in illumination. Once light appears, darkness has no argument. It must withdraw. This is why every negative verdict collapses when light is introduced. Not because of force, but because of authority. Light does not fight darkness. It replaces it. And when light remains, darkness cannot return. Prayer is not noise, and it is not a religious habit meant to make us feel better. In the realm of the spirit, prayer is a legal engagement. It is a transaction that enforces spiritual laws and activates divine authority. When prayer is reduced to emotion alone, people become loud but ineffective. But when prayer is understood as lawful interaction with God's system, it produces irreversible results. Every functioning system operates by laws. The natural world responds to physical laws, and the spiritual world responds to spiritual laws. God himself is a God of order, not chaos. He does not rule arbitrarily. He rules by principle. This is why prayer works, not because God is persuaded by desperation, but because prayer aligns a person with the laws that authorize divine intervention. Many believers pray sincerely yet see little change because they approach prayer as a plea rather than a transaction. They beg God to act, not realizing that God has already established legal frameworks for action. Prayer does not convince God to do what he is unwilling to do. Prayer gives him lawful access to intervene without violating his own justice. In spiritual dealings, legality matters. God will not override laws he established, even to help someone, unless the law itself provides a way. This is why prayer is powerful. It activates those provisions. Mercy, forgiveness, redemption, restoration, and victory are not emotional gestures. They are legal realities secured by covenant. When you pray correctly, you are not shouting at the problem. You are addressing the authority behind it. Problems persist because something is authorizing them. Prayer does not fight symptoms. It challenges permissions. Once permission is withdrawn, the problem has no choice but to leave. This is why effective prayer produces lasting freedom, not temporary relief. Consider this truth. Silence in the spirit is interpreted as consent. When believers do not pray, they unknowingly allow certain verdicts to stand uncontested. The enemy does not need your agreement to issue an accusation, but he needs your silence for it to remain effective. Prayer breaks that silence and initiates legal resistance. Prayer also involves alignment. A legal transaction requires both parties to agree on terms. When a believer prays while living in persistent rebellion, bitterness, or compromise, there is a conflict of interest. Heaven is just, and justice demands alignment. This does not mean perfection. It means surrender. Alignment removes contradictions that weaken prayer. This is why prayer must be approached with understanding. You are not trying to impress heaven with words. You are positioning yourself within divine order. When prayer aligns with truth, timing, and God's will, heaven responds with precision. Angels move not because of emotion, but because of instruction released through lawful prayer. Another dimension of prayer as transaction is declaration. Declarations are not positive thinking. They are verbal enforcement of what has been approved in the spirit. Once prayer secures a verdict, declarations establish it in the natural realm. Words spoken in alignment with God's judgment become instruments of enforcement. This is why careless words can sustain bondage, while intentional words can release freedom. Words carry authority because they express agreement. When prayer and declaration work together, they close doors that were legally opened and open doors that were previously restricted. Prayer also requires persistence, not because God is reluctant, but because systems sometimes resist change until authority is consistently enforced. Persistence is not begging repeatedly. It is standing firmly until the system fully aligns with the new verdict. Just as legal rulings take time to be enforced across institutions. Spiritual rulings sometimes require sustained enforcement. Understand this clearly. Prayer is not an escape from responsibility. It is an assumption of responsibility. When you pray, you are taking ownership of your spiritual jurisdiction. You are declaring that what happens in your life will no longer be dictated by unseen forces without challenge. So when you pray, pray with understanding. Pray knowing you are engaging a system governed by law. Pray knowing heaven listens not to noise, but to alignment. Pray knowing that once a verdict is changed in the spirit, the natural must eventually comply. This is the power of prayer, not as ritual, but as transaction. When prayer is lawful, results are inevitable. In the realm of the spirit, voices matter more than events. What speaks has authority, and what speaks louder determines outcomes. This is why accusations are dangerous, not because they are always true, but because they are voices. An accusation is an attempt to influence judgment by presenting evidence that demands punishment, delay, or denial. Many lives are trapped not by lack of effort, but by unchallenged accusations, speaking continuously against them. Accusations operate on facts, not on redemption. They point to failures, mistakes, weaknesses, and past errors. They remind the system of what went wrong and demand that consequences be enforced. In many cases, the facts presented are accurate. The danger is not in the accuracy of the facts, but in the conclusion they are used to support. Facts without mercy lead to condemnation. This is where the blood becomes central. The blood is not an emotional concept. It is a legal testimony. It does not deny the facts. It addresses their consequences. The blood acknowledges that something went wrong, but it declares that payment has already been made. In any judicial system, once payment is made, continued punishment becomes illegal. This is the authority the blood carries. The blood speaks louder because it carries higher authority. Accusations may be persistent, but they are inferior. They may be detailed, but they are outdated. They may be loud, but they are not final. The blood does not argue with accusations. It overrides them. It introduces a superior conclusion into the system. Many believers suffer because they are aware of the blood as doctrine, but not as evidence. They know it as theology, but not as legal reality. As a result, accusations continue to speak uncontested. Guilt becomes a lifestyle. Shame becomes an identity. Confidence in prayer disappears. But when the blood is understood as active testimony, boldness returns. The blood speaks on multiple levels. It speaks forgiveness where guilt demands punishment. It speaks access where sin demands separation. It speaks restoration where failure demands disqualification. It speaks mercy where judgment demands severity. Each of these is not emotional relief. It is judicial authority. One of the enemy's strategies is to keep believers focused on their unworthiness rather than on the worthiness of the sacrifice. When attention stays on personal failure, accusations remain effective. But when focus shifts to the blood, the basis of accusation collapses. Authority shifts from performance to covenant. This is why confession without faith in the blood leads to endless repentance with no freedom. People keep apologizing but never receive acquittal. They remain spiritually forgiven but mentally condemned. The blood was meant not only to cleanse the record, but also to silence the courtroom. The blood also protects from future accusations. It does not only address the past, it secures the future. Once a case is settled, it cannot be reopened without new evidence. The blood stands as permanent evidence that the matter has been resolved. This is why fear of judgment loses power when the blood is rightly understood. There are accusations that come from conscience, from people, and from spiritual adversaries. They manifest as constant reminders of past mistakes, a feeling of being unqualified, or a sense that blessing is undeserved. These feelings feel personal, but they are legal pressures. The blood answers them all with one voice: paid. When the blood speaks, heaven responds with confidence. Prayer becomes bold. Worship becomes free. Obedience becomes joyful. Not because a person is perfect, but because the case is closed. Closed cases do not require defense. This is why any attempt to cancel negative verdicts without invoking the blood is incomplete. Authority to overturn accusations does not come from self-improvement. It comes from substitution. Someone else stood in your place. Someone else took the penalty. Someone else satisfied justice. So when accusations arise, do not argue with them emotionally. Present the blood. When guilt whispers, answer with the blood. When condemnation shouts, answer with the blood. It is the loudest voice in the courtroom of heaven. And when the blood speaks, every accusation must fall silent. Not because mercy ignores justice, but because justice has already been satisfied. Alignment with God's will is one of the most underestimated forces in spiritual life. Many people desire change, breakthrough, and reversal, but few understand that speed in the spirit is a product of alignment. God is never slow, but his operations follow order. When a person's heart, choices, and direction are aligned with God's will, resistance reduces and divine movement accelerates. Misalignment does not always look like obvious sin. Sometimes it looks like good intentions with wrong direction. Other times it looks like sincere prayer mixed with stubborn preferences. A person can be passionate yet misaligned, spiritual yet disordered, gifted yet positioned wrongly. Heaven responds to sincerity, but it moves fastest with alignment. God's will is not mysterious in the sense that it is hidden to frustrate people. It is revealed progressively through truth, obedience, and sensitivity. Alignment simply means agreeing with what God has revealed, not insisting on what feels comfortable. The moment alignment occurs, many struggles that required intense prayer suddenly resolve with ease. Negative verdicts often remain effective, not because God refuses to cancel them, but because misalignment gives them continued legal access. When a person insists on a path God did not authorize, even divine help becomes limited. Not because God is harsh, but because justice demands order. God cannot fully bless what contradicts his will. Alignment removes friction. Friction is what slows movement. In the spirit, friction is caused by inner conflict, wanting God's help without wanting God's way. When alignment happens, inner resistance disappears and power flows freely. This is why some people experience sudden reversals after simple acts of obedience that seemed unrelated to their problem. God's will is not only about moral behavior, it is also about timing, associations, and positioning. Being in the wrong place at the right time can still produce delay. Being with the wrong people can prolong battles that prayer alone cannot end. Alignment corrects placement, and correct placement attracts favor. Many delays are not demonic, they are directional. God is not withholding answers, he is waiting for alignment. The moment alignment occurs, answers that were already prepared are released. This is why breakthroughs sometimes feel sudden. They were not created in that moment, they were activated. Alignment also silences accusations. When a believer walks in alignment, the enemy loses legal grounds. Accusations thrive on inconsistency, but when conduct, belief, and confession agree with God's will, accusations weaken. Authority increases because credibility is restored. This does not mean perfection. Alignment is not flawlessness. It is surrender. It is choosing God's verdict over personal opinion. It is allowing correction without offense. It is adjusting direction without pride. Heaven responds powerfully to teachable hearts. Alignment sharpens spiritual hearing. When a person is aligned, discernment increases. Decisions become clearer. Confusion lifts. This clarity itself accelerates progress. Many people are delayed not by opposition but by indecision. Alignment removes indecision because the will of God becomes priority. When alignment is present, even opposition works in your favor. Resistance becomes redirection. Delays become preparation. Battles become testimonies. This is because God can trust aligned people with outcomes. He knows they will not misuse acceleration. One of the signs of alignment is peace, not the absence of problems, but inner certainty. This peace is not emotional comfort. It is spiritual approval. It signals that you are positioned correctly. From that position, divine reversals happen with minimal struggle. Alignment also sustains results. Many people experience breakthroughs they cannot maintain because alignment was temporary. God desires not just to lift you, but to keep you. Alignment ensures longevity. It prevents recycled battles. So understand this deeply. Alignment is not a suggestion, it is a strategy. It does not replace prayer, it empowers it. It does not replace faith, it focuses it. When alignment meets prayer, heaven moves quickly. This is why divine reversals accelerate when alignment is restored. Not because God suddenly becomes willing, but because order has been established. And once order is in place, power flows without obstruction. Declarations are not motivational statements or positive affirmations designed to make a person feel better. In the realm of the spirit, declarations are authoritative enforcements. They are verbal confirmations of what has already been settled in the spirit through prayer. Prayer secures the verdict. Declaration seals it. Without declarations, many victories remain approved in heaven, but unenforced on earth. Every system responds to words because words carry agreement. What you consistently say reveals what you agree with, and what you agree with gains the right to manifest. Silence after prayer often allows old verdicts to reassert themselves. This is why some people pray powerfully, yet speak fearfully afterward, unknowingly reopening doors they just closed. Declarations prevent reversal. When God speaks, his words do not return empty. Human declarations derive power when they align with God's verdict. You are not creating reality with your words. You are enforcing heaven's reality in the earth. This distinction matters. Declarations without prayer become empty confidence, but declarations after prayer become spiritual law. Declarations establish boundaries. They announce to systems, seen and unseen, what is permitted and what is no longer allowed. Just as laws are read publicly to inform citizens, declarations inform the spiritual realm that a new ruling is in effect. Darkness respects clarity. Ambiguity invites interference, but clear declarations close access points. Many believers lose victories because they assume prayer alone is enough. Prayer changes the ruling, but declarations maintain it. This is why consistency matters. One declaration spoken once has impact, but declarations spoken repeatedly build atmosphere. Atmosphere influences behavior, decisions, and outcomes. Declarations also reprogram the mind. The mind is often the last place to accept spiritual change. Even after a verdict is cancelled, memory tries to enforce the old outcome. Declarations confront memory with truth. They train the soul to agree with the spirit. Over time, fear loses its voice, doubt weakens, and confidence grows, not artificially but legally. There are declarations that confront identity. Negative verdicts often attach themselves to how a person sees themselves. I am unlucky. I always fail. Nothing works for me. These are not just thoughts. They are verbal agreements. Declarations break those agreements and replace them with truth-based identity. Declarations also attract alignment. When you speak consistently, your actions begin to follow your words. Choices adjust. Discernment sharpens. You begin to reject what contradicts what you have declared. This is how declarations protect destiny. They become internal laws governing behavior. In spiritual enforcement, timing matters. Declarations are most powerful immediately after prayer, because that is when the verdict is fresh. Just as a court ruling is announced and then enforced, declarations announce that enforcement has begun. Waiting too long allows resistance to regroup. Declarations must be specific. Vague words produce weak enforcement. Clear declarations produce clear results. This is why clarity in prayer leads to clarity in speech. When you know what heaven has ruled, you declare it boldly and precisely. Declarations also function as resistance. When pressure arises after prayer, declarations remind the system that the case is closed. They are not arguments, they are reminders. Resistance does not mean the verdict has changed. It often means enforcement is underway. It is important to understand that declarations are not denial of reality. They are alignment with higher reality. You may declare healing while symptoms remain, not because you ignore symptoms, but because you recognize that symptoms are inferior to divine verdicts. Over time, the inferior must submit. Declarations also invite divine partnership. Angels respond to words aligned with God's will. They move on instructions, not emotions. When declarations echo heaven's verdict, assistance is activated. Silence limits engagement. Agreement releases it. Finally, declarations sustain faith. Faith is not sustained by silence. It is sustained by confession. When you declare consistently, faith remains active. You remind yourself and the environment that the outcome has been decided. So understand this clearly. Prayer wins the case, but declarations enforce the judgment. Prayer changes the record. Declarations change the experience. When declarations are consistent, aligned, and bold, what God has ruled becomes what you live. And once a verdict is sealed by declaration, it stands firm. What heaven has established, earth must reflect. Everything you have heard comes down to one unshakable truth. Your life is not at the mercy of negative verdicts. Systems may have spoken, circumstances may have concluded, and history may appear convincing, but none of these outrank the authority of God. When heaven speaks, earth must adjust. When God rules, every inferior judgment loses its power to stand. Negative verdicts survive on silence, ignorance, and fear. But light exposes them. Prayer challenges them. The blood silences accusations. Alignment removes legal access. And declarations enforce new realities. This is not religious optimism. It is spiritual order. What has been wrongly authorized can be lawfully cancelled. What has delayed you can be reviewed. What has resisted you can be replaced. Understand this clearly. Cancellation is not denial of the past. It is redemption of the future. God does not erase history. He overrules it. He does not pretend nothing happened. He declares that what happened no longer has authority. This is why freedom begins, not when circumstances change, but when rulings change. As you step forward, do not return to agreement with old conclusions. Guard your words, guard your alignment, guard your understanding. What you tolerate verbally, you permit spiritually. What you declare in faith, you establish legally. This Monday is not just another day. It is a line of demarcation, a moment where heaven's judgment supersedes earthly conclusions. Walk forward with confidence, not arrogance, with humility, not fear. The verdict has been reviewed. The ruling has shifted. Now remain consistent. Consistency sustains victory. Speak what God has ruled. Align with what he has approved. And trust that what has been settled in the spirit will manifest in the natural. The case is closed. The season has shifted. And the outcome will speak louder than every accusation. Amen.